Have you ever wondered how an entire armored column could fall apart because of a weapon so small that enemy soldiers called it a metal pipe on a stick? What kind of rifle was powerful enough to tear open a tankette in seconds, leaving crews stunned, deafened or gone before they even knew they'd been targeted? And how did the Soviet gun, mocked by both Japan and Germany for its ugly shape, become the hidden force that shattered light armor across the hills and ravines of Manchuria? It wasn't size. It wasn't armor. It was a weapon designed for one purpose: to punch through steel. The PTRD-41 could rupture thin Japanese plating so violently that turrets popped, engines burst, and formations collapsed under sudden, precise ambush fire. To understand how this crude, unimpressive rifle reshaped the final days of the war, we have to return to the moment the Soviets first built it and the battlefield that proved everyone wrong. When the Red Army first imagined a lightweight anti-tank rifle, the plan seemed straightforward. Infantry needed something simple, cheap and easy to carry, a tool that could be produced quickly and handled by soldiers with minimal training. In the early years of the war, factories were already straining under pressure, and every new weapon had to fit into a system designed around speed, improvisation, and survival. The PTRD-41 emerged from this environment, shaped more by necessity than by elegance. Steel tubes, wooden furniture, and a long, thin barrel created a shape that looked more accidental than engineered. Even on the testing grounds, officers raised eyebrows at the crude form, wondering if such a device could threaten anything larger than a lightly armored car. Its designers focused on one idea: a single, fast, high-velocity shot that could punch straight through thin armor. The PTRD was not built for repeated fire or complex mechanics. It used a simple single-shot action, with a massive 14.5mm round, relying on speed rather than volume. Recoil was enormous. The muzzle flash was bright. The sound cracked through the testing field like a whip. Despite the violence, the weapon remained functional and dependable. It needed no water-cooling jacket, no belt-fed system, and no special maintenance. Simplicity was its strength. However, simplicity did not convince its critics. German observers who captured early examples made notes describing it as primitive. Japanese officers examining propaganda images and intelligence reports dismissed it as an improvised pipe with an oversized bullet. Even some Soviet soldiers questioned its usefulness, especially once German armor grew thicker and more complex. The reputation of the PTRD suffered before it even arrived in large numbers. Commanders often preferred heavier anti-tank guns or artillery, believing those weapons offered more reliable results. Yet the PTRD continued to roll out of factories in the thousands, loaded onto trains heading toward the front. When the rifle reached frontline units, the first impression rarely changed. Soldiers felt the weight during long marches and noticed how awkward it was to move through forests or trenches. The long barrel snagged on branches. The recoil pad did little to soften the punishment. Many carried it reluctantly, viewing it as a burden or a backup tool rather than a true tank killer. But the battlefield always has a way of revealing truths that training fields cannot, and soon the rifle's hidden ability started to show itself in moments of extreme desperation. During the defensive fighting of 1941 and 1942, Soviet infantry often faced German armored cars, half-tracks, and early-model tanks bursting through smoke and snow. At close ranges, where visibility dropped and the sound of engines drowned out orders, soldiers learned to use terrain as a natural equalizer. Ravines, village corners, wrecked walls, and forest trails created short-distance kill zones. In these tight spaces, the PTRD suddenly made sense. A single well-placed shot at under 100 meters could crack armor plates or punch through steel in a way that surprised even experienced gunners. The bullet traveled so fast that hits sounded like metal tearing rather than being struck. Crews inside armored cars sometimes never knew the direction of the shot that defeated them. These early successes changed opinions. Infantrymen wrote short reports describing the weapon's power against thin armor. Some recounted how the recoil almost knocked them backward, yet delivered enough kinetic force to split open an engine block. In the chaos of those engagements, simplicity became an advantage again. There was no jam to clear, no feed system to maintain, and no complex mechanism to fail in freezing weather. A soldier needed only to pull the barrel open, slide in another round, and fire again if the situation allowed. Despite these improvements in reputation, the PTRD still existed in a strange middle ground. It was neither a prestigious weapon nor a symbol of Soviet engineering. It remained the rifle that looked like a pipe, carried by soldiers who often preferred something else. German tanks became thicker and harder to penetrate, pushing anti-tank rifles into more specialized roles. Yet the weapon continued to find relevance. Soviet doctrine began to adapt, teaching infantry to use it as a close-range ambush tool. They learned where to aim, which angles mattered, and how the round behaved when striking armor joints or weaker plates. Behind every adjustment was a growing sense that the rifle's true potential depended on the enemy it faced. Against light vehicles, reconnaissance cars, tankettes, and older armored transports, the PTRD was more than effective. The bullet penetrated thin plates so violently that mechanical ruptures occurred around entry points. Fuel leaked, engines stalled, turrets jammed. For enemies relying on lighter armored tactics, the rifle represented a real danger. This understanding quietly grew as the war moved toward new stages. Meanwhile, far to the east, Japanese forces in Asia prepared for a very different type of war. Their mechanized units operated largely with outdated armor designs. Many of their vehicles favored speed and mobility over protection, a philosophy suited for earlier conflicts rather than late war engagements. Intelligence analysts and foreign officers observed this, but the consequences were not yet clear. Japanese commanders believed the Soviet Union would not launch a major offensive in the region, so there was little urgency to modernize armor or strengthen plating. Tankettes and light armored cars remained the backbone of their formations. Inside Soviet planning rooms, especially as 1944 turned into 1945, discussions shifted toward the possibility of a large-scale attack on Japanese positions in Manchuria. Commanders examined the terrain: forests, river valleys, sudden slopes, and narrow roads. All of it resembled the kind of battlefield where short-range engagements were likely. If fighting erupted there, infantry ambush tactics would matter as much as mechanized pushes. And in these conditions, the PTRD-41 could become relevant once again. This understanding slowly reframed the weapon's place in the Red Army. Instead of being viewed as an obsolete piece of early war equipment, it became a practical tool for the environment the Soviets expected to face. Training manuals reminded units that not all enemies wore thick armor, and that light vehicles were still a threat, capable of dangerous flanking maneuvers. Soldiers who had experience with the rifle explained techniques to new recruits, focusing on aiming points, timing, and choosing good firing positions. As preparation for the Manchurian campaign intensified, PTRD teams were assigned near the front of mechanized columns. They trained to move quickly between positions, using the rifle not only against armored targets, but also against bunkers, loopholes, and machine gun nests, where the powerful round could penetrate wooden or lightly reinforced structures. The rifle's versatility made it valuable, even if it was still considered inelegant. By the time the Soviets finished planning their August 1945 offensive, thousands of PTRD rifles were distributed to infantry units, cavalry brigades, and motorized detachments. The rifle that once seemed destined for irrelevance had quietly returned as a frontline asset, perfectly suited for the environment it would soon confront. Soldiers marched east with the familiar weight across their shoulders, unaware that the battles ahead would finally reveal the true power hidden inside that awkward steel tube. The stage was set, Manchuria awaited, and the ugly Duckling rifle was about to prove every critic wrong. When the Red Army pushed westward again after the early disasters of the war, the battlefield had changed in ways no designer of the PTRD had originally imagined. German armor grew stronger and thicker every month, and heavy tanks now roamed landscapes once dominated by lighter vehicles. For many frontline units, anti-tank rifles seemed outdated against these new machines. But war seldom moves in one direction. Even as German armor improved, the number of lightly armored or thinly protected vehicles increased across the front. Supply carriers, reconnaissance cars, half-tracks, command vehicles, and early-generation tanks still operated in large numbers, and all of them remained vulnerable to a fast, precise 14.5mm shot fired from close range. Infantry units learned this through experience rather than instruction. Wherever a defensive line struggled to hold, PTRD teams appeared along trenches, shell craters, or forest edges. The rifle's long barrel rested on makeshift supports, ready to fire at any vehicle attempting to break through gaps. Although the weapon could not stop the heaviest armor, it disrupted exactly the type of machines that created those early breakthroughs, the quick-moving transport vehicles that carried infantry or supplies into weak points. The rifle began to develop a place in this changing environment, filling gaps left by heavier anti-tank guns that could not be everywhere at once. A typical day for PTRD teams involved long periods of silence, interrupted by moments of extreme violence. Many soldiers waited for hours in shallow pits, snow-filled trenches or tall grass, watching distant tree lines for dust clouds or engine smoke. Once a target appeared, everything changed. The rifle's recoil demanded a stable position, so the shooter braced behind the weapon with careful posture, while the assistant rechecked ammunition. Even a fraction of a second mattered. If the target crossed the open ground too quickly, the shot might strike at the wrong angle, bounce off an armor slope, or fail to hit a weak point. If fired too late, the vehicle could run over the position entirely. This tension shaped how the rifle earned respect. Soldiers who once mocked it began to notice its results. Light German armored cars hit by the high-velocity projectile sometimes crumpled along panel edges, and engines burst into smoke. Some vehicles rolled a few meters more before stopping, leaving black tracks in the mud. Infantry nearby could feel the shockwave of the impact. In certain cases, the round traveled through the thin plating and continued out the other side, carrying fragments with it. Units recorded these events in field reports, slowly changing the reputation of the weapon from a curious relic to a reliable tool for ambushes. The rifle also influenced infantry behavior. Instead of viewing anti-tank defense as the responsibility of heavy guns alone, smaller squads began developing their own ambush patterns. PTRD shooters waited near choke points, crossroads, forest clearings, and gaps between destroyed buildings. These were places where light armored vehicles attempted to maneuver ahead of infantry or scout new paths. A well-placed shot could stop a reconnaissance vehicle and slow the advance of an entire German platoon. This delay allowed Soviet forces to reinforce positions or set up new defenses. Terrain played a crucial role. In dense forests, narrow ravines, and ruined cities, tanks could not always use their strengths. Armor protection mattered less when vehicles were forced to travel along predictable paths. This environment suited the PTRD perfectly. Shooters learned to aim for tires, axles, turret rings, and engine housings, understanding that disabling a vehicle's movement was often more important than destroying it completely. A stopped machine late in the war became a liability for the enemy, blocking other vehicles or exposing the crew to further fire. The rifle's simplicity became more valuable as the war's pace increased. Conditions at the front were often harsh, with mud, snow, and dirt covering every piece of equipment. Complex weapons sometimes jammed or malfunctioned when frozen oil stiffened mechanisms. The PTRD, with its straightforward design, survived these conditions. A soldier could pull back the barrel block, insert a round, and fire again with minimal preparation. Even in severe cold, the weapon continued to operate with consistent reliability. This performance under pressure built trust among those who carried it. As Soviet doctrine evolved, specialists began training new recruits specifically for anti-tank rifle roles. These men learned not just how to shoot, but how to choose firing angles that increased penetration. They used shadows, burned out wrecks or snowbanks to hide their positions, waiting for fleeting moments when a vehicle's flank or rear passed through their line of fire. The rifle became part of a system. Smoke screens, infantry movement, and coordinated ambushes supported these shooters. When used skillfully, they disrupted enemy advances with surprising effectiveness. The weapon also found uses beyond its original purpose. Its powerful round could punch through wooden structures, light fortifications, and machine gun nests. In certain battles, PTRD teams supported infantry assaults by targeting defensive positions where enemy gunners hid behind planks or weak concrete. The round tore through these barriers and forced defenders to abandon cover. This secondary role extended the weapon's utility and gave commanders more flexible tools during assaults. Despite these strengths, the PTRD remained a difficult weapon to carry. Its length made movement through forests or ruins slow and awkward. Soldiers often had to lift the front end over rubble or angle it sideways through narrow paths. The recoil caused bruising and shoulder pain, especially during repeated shots. Many shooters developed a careful rhythm to control the impact, leaning their bodies into the rifle at the exact moment of firing. These challenges ensured that only determined soldiers mastered the weapon effectively. The Eastern Front's unique conditions pushed the rifle into unexpected prominence. While German armor grew heavier, many of the vehicles encountered on secondary roads or during flanking attempts were thinly protected. Reconnaissance units, supply convoys, and lightly armored escorts remained essential to German mobility. Whenever these vehicles appeared at close range, PTRD teams had opportunities to influence the battle. Even if the rifle could not destroy the heaviest tanks, it disrupted the flow of operations around them. War relied on movement, communication, and logistics, and the PTRD targeted these vulnerable links. As 1944 progressed and Soviet forces advanced, new challenges emerged. Battles stretched across larger areas, and infantry had to keep pace with armored spearheads. The PTRD moved with them, carried across rivers, over hills, and through destroyed towns. In some operations, cavalry units used it as a mobile ambush weapon, firing from behind natural cover before moving again. Motorized units placed PTRD teams on trucks so they could deploy rapidly. The rifle adjusted to the shifting nature of warfare through the adaptability of the soldiers who used it. By the time German intelligence realized the full extent of the rifle's continuing threat, the Eastern Front had already changed. Soviet units were preparing for new offensives, and the weapon's fate would soon be shaped by a different enemy altogether. While the rifle's power against German heavy armor had declined, its relevance against lighter vehicles remained strong. This reality became important when the focus of Soviet operations shifted eastward. As plans for the Manchurian campaign matured, commanders reviewed the lessons learned on the Western Front. They understood that Japanese forces relied heavily on light tankettes, armored cars, and thinly plated vehicles. These machines, once adequate for earlier conflicts, were now vulnerable to high-velocity rounds like the 14.5mm. Intelligence analysts recognized the potential advantage. The PTRD, though no longer a star on European battlefields, could become a decisive tool in Asia. The rifle's journey had shifted from reluctance to practicality. It adapted to changing environments, earned trust through consistent performance, and found relevance in roles beyond what designers expected. Every success added another layer of respect, and every battlefield revealed new strengths. The stage was set for the weapon's finest moment, still waiting across the mountains and valleys of Manchuria. As the final year of the war approached, the Soviet High Command began shaping plans for a massive campaign in the Far East. The European fronts were collapsing, and the Red Army prepared to redirect its strength toward Japanese-occupied Manchuria. For many infantrymen, this shift felt like entering a different world. Instead of the burned villages and shattered cities of Europe, they now faced sharp mountain ranges, deep forests and long valleys that stretched between isolated settlements. The Soviets studied maps and aerial photos, noticing how narrow roads, steep riverbanks, and sudden turns created natural choke points. These features would play a major role in any advance, and they suited the use of simple, direct weapons that worked well at short distances. Units preparing for the offensive carried many types of equipment, but one weapon blended almost unnoticed into the columns, the PTRD-41. It was strapped to supply vehicles, tied to the sides of cavalry saddles, or simply carried across the shoulders of infantry moving east. Soldiers who had fought in Europe recognized it immediately. They remembered the long barrel, the heavy recoil, and the sharp crack when fired. Some wondered how much use it would have against Japanese forces, whose armor was considered outdated. Others simply viewed it as another tool, ready for unexpected moments. The landscape itself hinted at how important the rifle might become. Manchuria was filled with steep hills that forced vehicles to climb slowly, exposing their sides to anyone watching from above. Narrow passes funneled columns into single-file lines. Ravines acted like trenches carved by nature, hiding small teams who could strike without warning. Streams and rivers cut across roads, making bridges essential points of vulnerability. Every geographic feature suggested that close-range fighting was likely, and in such conditions, a fast, penetrating shot could be decisive. Japanese armored forces in the region relied heavily on older designs, such as the Type 94 tankette, the Type 97 light tank, and several lightly armored cars used for scouting. These vehicles carried thin plates intended to protect crews from small arms fire, not from high-velocity anti-tank rounds. Their engines were exposed from certain angles, and their riveted construction created weak points around joints. Japanese doctrine valued mobility over protection, and their vehicles reflected this philosophy. On open ground, these machines might maneuver quickly, but in Manchuria's tight forest paths and broken terrain, mobility became limited, exposing their vulnerabilities. Soviet commanders understood this advantage. They prepared PTRD teams to travel near the front of advancing units, ready to strike whenever Japanese vehicles attempted to block roads or counterattack narrow advances. The rifle was ideal for ambush fire in places where heavy anti-tank guns could not be moved easily. Infantry squads practiced positioning the weapon behind fallen logs, rocky slopes, or the edges of villages. Shooters learned to wait for the moment when a tankette turned slightly or slowed while climbing. Even a brief hesitation could offer the perfect angle for a penetrating shot. The offensive began in August 1945 with a massive push from multiple directions. Soviet forces crossed borders, rivers, and mountain passes in coordinated movements, catching many Japanese units off guard. Weather conditions shifted rapidly. Fog covered morning valleys, while afternoons brought bright sunlight that reflected off rocks and riverbanks. Vehicles struggled along uneven roads carved into hillsides. The heavy rains of the season softened the earth, turning open ground into sticky mud and forcing armored cars to move slower than intended. These conditions shaped the PTRD's role from the first days of the campaign. In several early engagements, Japanese tankettes attempted to block or delay Soviet infantry advances along narrow mountain roads. The thin-sided vehicles seemed prepared for quick hit-and-run tactics, but the terrain betrayed them. As soon as they slowed to navigate sharp corners or muddy slopes, Soviet shooters positioned above or beside the road opened fire. The long rifle barrel rested on natural supports, and the powerful round tore through steel with ease. Many vehicles were disabled before they could respond. Some lost mobility when wheels or track components shattered. Others suffered engine failures from direct hits. Infantry quickly moved past the wrecks, continuing the advance. In the dense forests of Manchuria, Japanese reconnaissance vehicles often appeared suddenly, emerging from behind hills or tree clusters. These vehicles attempted to spot Soviet positions or coordinate artillery strikes. When they approached too closely, PTRD teams responded from hidden positions. The heavy round sometimes passed through thin armor and embedded itself in nearby trees or earth, leaving sharp holes in both metal and wood. The damage patterns looked similar to earlier European battles, reminding soldiers of the rifle's enduring power. Japanese crews sometimes abandoned their vehicles after the first shot, realizing the armor offered little protection. Villages and small settlements scattered across Manchuria also became important fighting areas. Many had wooden structures, stone walls, or narrow lanes suitable for close-range ambushes. PTRD teams moved through these areas carefully, looking for firing positions that offered stability and concealment. The rifle's long barrel extended through doorways or windows, and shooters waited for Japanese vehicles attempting to cut off Soviet movement. A single penetrating round could disable a vehicle blocking an alley or courtyard, allowing infantry to clear the area without heavy support. The rifle also helped counter Japanese armored escorts, protecting retreating units. When Japanese forces attempted to move quickly through valleys or open fields, PTRD teams targeted vehicles that ventured too far ahead of infantry. The destruction of a lead or rear vehicle disrupted the entire formation, creating confusion that slowed the retreat. Soviet commanders took advantage of these moments to advance more rapidly, gaining ground before Japanese reinforcements could regroup. In addition to fighting armor, PTRD rounds proved effective against defensive positions. Many Japanese soldiers used wooden bunkers or earth-covered firing posts built hastily along roads. The powerful round penetrated these structures easily, forcing defenders to leave their positions or suffer severe damage. Infantry squads used the rifle to break open small fortifications before pushing forward, reducing resistance without needing heavier weapons. Night operations added another layer of importance to the rifle. Japanese forces sometimes attempted to move vehicles under cover of darkness, hoping to avoid Soviet aircraft and artillery. In the dim light, engines and silhouettes were easier to detect than exact details. PTRD shooters fired at sound and movement, aiming at engine blocks where the armor was weakest. The bright muzzle flash illuminated their surroundings, but the damage caused by successful shots outweighed the risk. Disabled vehicles became obstacles that slowed enemy movement and created opportunities for further attacks. As the campaign continued, Japanese commanders realized how vulnerable their vehicles were. Some attempted to reposition armor deeper in defensive lines, but terrain again limited movement. In many areas, Japanese units had no choice but to rely on the same roads the Soviets advanced along. These roads became predictable routes, where PTRD teams waited patiently. The rifle's simplicity allowed it to function even after long marches, exposure to rain or rough handling. Every successful engagement reinforced its value. Each day of the offensive revealed more about how well the weapon fit the environment. It required no fuel, little maintenance, and minimal logistical support. A single soldier and an assistant could move it through terrain where heavy guns could not go. The weapon's power remained constant, regardless of weather or elevation. Japanese vehicles, however, struggled with overheating engines, difficult climbs, and narrow passages that exposed them to ambush. By the time Soviet forces reached deeper into Manchuria, the PTRD had become a familiar presence in every major column. It played roles that other weapons could not fulfill. It opened narrow roads, defended flanks, cleared scouting threats, and disrupted armored escorts. The campaign's geography magnified its strengths and highlighted the weaknesses of Japanese armor. The rifle that once seemed outdated now felt as though it had been designed specifically for this battlefield. Each valley, ridge, and forest path became a stage where its power shaped outcomes. And as the Soviets pushed toward the heart of Japanese defenses, the PTRD's impact was only beginning to reveal its true scale. When the full weight of the Soviet offensive crashed into Manchuria, the Japanese armored units were among the first to feel the consequences of their outdated equipment. Many of their vehicles were built for earlier conflicts against light resistance, not for a modern high-speed assault led by experienced troops carrying powerful anti-armor weapons. As Soviet formations pushed across mountains, forests, and valleys, Japanese tankettes and light-armored cars attempted to form quick defensive screens. These screens were meant to delay the advance long enough for infantry to regroup. Instead, they walked directly into the weapon that most Japanese planners had dismissed, the PTRD-41. The first major clashes revealed how unprepared Japanese crews were for the rifle's penetration power. Soviet infantry moved through hills or forests ahead of larger formations, creating scattered but effective ambush teams. When Japanese tankettes rolled around corners or crested small rises, they often found themselves exposed at close range. At such distances, the PTRD's 14.5mm round cut through their thin plating as if it were tin. The shots created sharp bursts of sparks, followed by sudden smoke or flame. Sometimes the entire side of a vehicle buckled around the point of impact. These reactions stunned Japanese soldiers who had expected rifle or machine gun fire, not armor-piercing rounds capable of tearing open an engine block. In several sectors, Japanese units attempted to use speed as protection. Tankettes rushed ahead of infantry formations, hoping to scatter Soviet scouts. This tactic sometimes worked in earlier wars, but Manchuria's terrain and the presence of anti-tank rifles changed everything. The narrow roads allowed little room for sudden turns, and dense vegetation limited vision. PTRD teams set up firing positions behind rocks, mounds of earth, or groups of trees. When a tankette passed within the ideal range, the shooter braced the long barrel, waited for the brief moment when armor faced the right angle, and fired. The bullet traveled with such velocity that the impact echoed across the hills. Once disabled, the vehicle skidded, slowed, or rolled to a halt, blocking the path behind it. Japanese commanders faced difficult choices. If they pushed their armor too far forward, the vehicles were picked off quickly. If they kept them too far back, Soviet infantry advanced with little opposition. Many Japanese units lacked stronger tanks that could withstand the rifle's penetrating power. Even attempts to reinforce certain areas with makeshift barriers or sand-filled containers on the hulls did little to stop the heavy round. The force of impact often cracked weak spots, bent internal frames, or shook components loose. These effects created panic among crews who were not trained to face close-range anti-tank fire. The psychological impact was intense. Japanese armored crews realized that their protection offered little safety. When the first round hit, the interior of a vehicle often filled with noise, dust, and sharp fragments. Crews sometimes suffered injuries not only from penetration, but from shock waves that bounced around inside the thin armor. Engines stalled, vision ports cracked, and gears jammed. Even if the round did not hit a crew member directly, the sudden mechanical failure left them stranded on the road, unable to escape quickly enough. This vulnerability caused hesitation among Japanese drivers, who slowed their advance in terrain where speed was essential. The PTRD's simplicity made it even more effective in these chaotic moments. Shooters did not need complex adjustments or long preparation times. Once the first shot landed, they pulled the barrel open, inserted another round, and fired again if the situation allowed. Some teams managed to hit multiple vehicles in a single encounter, especially when Japanese units advanced in tight columns. A damaged lead vehicle often trapped those behind it, creating a chain reaction of stalled movement. Soviet troops then closed in through the forest, or climbed down slopes to surround the immobilized column. The effect of the rifle extended beyond ambushes. In open valleys or grasslands, Japanese forces tried to form defensive lines using armored cars positioned behind infantry. These vehicles served as command posts or machine gun platforms. The PTRD targeted them from long distances, where the armor was weakest. Air shot to the side of a turret or the rear of an engine compartment disabled vehicles critical to communication and coordination. Once these vehicles were knocked out, Japanese lines lost cohesion. Infantry struggled to maintain direction, and the Soviets used the confusion to advance with greater speed. The rifle also became useful in assault operations against Japanese strongpoints. Many of these positions were supported by lightly armored vehicles placed inside or near fortified areas. Soviet infantry approached from unexpected angles, using elevation or vegetation for cover. The PTRD punched through wooden walls, light barricades, or weak steel plates. These shots forced defenders to reposition or abandon the vehicles entirely. Without mobile support, Japanese strongpoints became easier to isolate and overcome. The weapon's impact became more visible in areas where Japanese forces attempted withdrawals. Retreating units moved along fixed routes, often squeezed between mountains or dense forest. PTRD teams positioned themselves on ridges or slopes overlooking the retreat paths. When Japanese vehicles appeared below, the shooters fired downward into exposed tops or side panels. The high-velocity round easily pierced these thin plates, neutralizing vehicles that otherwise might have escaped. With their escape routes blocked, many Japanese units found themselves trapped, slowing their withdrawal and reducing their ability to regroup. As days passed, Soviet reconnaissance teams reported consistent patterns. Japanese armor rarely survived first contact with PTRD-equipped infantry. This information quickly spread across the Soviet ranks. Confidence grew. Infantry squads understood that even without heavy guns or close tank support, they could confront Japanese mechanized resistance effectively. This shift in morale influenced how Soviet columns moved. Soldiers advanced more aggressively through tight passes or narrow roads, knowing they had tools capable of countering the limited armor Japan deployed. On the Japanese side, frustration and confusion increased. Their vehicles had been designed for different environments and different enemies. The armor thickness that once felt adequate now felt dangerously thin. Many Japanese units tried to rely more heavily on infantry screens rather than armored thrusts, but by then the Soviets had already adapted to every tactic. Whenever armor appeared, even in small numbers, the PTRD teams prepared themselves. When armor remained hidden or delayed, the Soviet push gained momentum anyway. The Manchurian terrain amplified every weakness in the Japanese machines. Steep climbs forced vehicles to slow down or expose unprotected parts of their hulls. Muddy roads made maneuvering difficult. Sharp turns prevented drivers from avoiding ambush zones. The Soviets watched, learned, and positioned themselves with increasing precision. The rifle's long barrel rested comfortably on natural supports, and its heavy round continued doing exactly what it had been designed to do. As the offensive reached deeper into Japanese territory, the consequences became undeniable. The PTRD-41, once mocked as a crude metal pipe, had become a decisive tool on the battlefield. It shattered armored screens, disrupted retreats, opened roadblocks, and broke the confidence of Japanese armored crews. Every clash pushed Japanese forces closer to collapse, and every destroyed vehicle left another warning to the units still fighting ahead. The rifle had moved beyond its old reputation. In Manchuria, it was no longer underestimated. It was feared, and the advance had only accelerated. As the Soviet advance pushed deeper into Manchuria, the momentum of the offensive grew stronger each day. Roads that once felt distant and quiet were now filled with the movement of entire armies. Infantry marched alongside columns of tanks and trucks, while cavalry units crossed the hills to search for hidden routes. Every formation moved with urgency, determined to prevent Japanese forces from regrouping or forming new defensive lines. In this fast and chaotic environment, the PTRD-41 followed every step, carried on shoulders strapped to vehicles, or held ready in the hands of small ambush teams scattered across the front. Japanese resistance became increasingly fragmented. Their armored units attempted to form defensive pockets around key towns, bridges, and mountain passes. These pockets relied on light vehicles placed at strategic points, but the worn condition of many machines made them especially vulnerable. Engines overheated during long climbs, thin tracks slipped on wet slopes, and the thin armor plates vibrated with each movement. As Japanese forces tried to hold back the rapid Soviet push, their vehicles became choke points that the Red Army targeted with precision. Soviet infantry, accustomed to fighting in varied terrain after years on the European front, knew exactly how to use the PTRD in these situations. Small teams moved ahead of the main advance, clearing roads and checking every curve or ridge for ambush positions. When they found Japanese vehicles blocking a route, they prepared firing points that used the terrain's natural shapes. The long rifle rested on rocks, fallen trunks, or the edges of terraces carved into the hills. As soon as a firing angle aligned, the shooter steadied his breath and pulled the trigger. The heavy round slammed into the vehicle's vulnerable sections, punching holes through metal and forcing the Japanese crews to abandon their positions. Many attacks followed the same pattern. A disabled lead vehicle trapped the others behind it. Unable to maneuver, the remaining tankettes and cars became easy targets for infantry, with PTRDs or grenades. In these moments, entire Japanese defensive positions collapsed faster than expected. Soviet commanders recognized this pattern and began to incorporate anti-tank rifle teams deliberately into their assault plans. They placed PTRD shooters near the front of advancing lines, ready to open the way each time a Japanese armored group attempted to block the path. The landscape continued to shape every engagement. Wide plains allowed Soviet armored divisions to push forward at full strength, while narrow valleys created natural pressure points where Japanese forces attempted their last stands. In these tight spaces, the PTRD became even more valuable. Heavy Soviet guns struggled to aim along steep slopes or angled roads, but a two-man anti-tank rifle team could climb or crawl to positions impossible for larger weapons. The rifle's portability allowed it to reach high ledges or hidden depressions that overlooked Japanese positions. From these vantage points, shooters targeted weak armor spots that lay exposed under the harsh sun. The rifle also supported larger coordinated actions. When Soviet tanks moved into contested areas, PTRD teams protected their flanks. They targeted Japanese vehicles that attempted to come from the sides or slip behind armored formations. By eliminating these threats, the teams prevented Japanese forces from cutting supply lines or threatening artillery positions. The consistency of these actions strengthened the overall advance. The rifle acted as a quiet guardian along the edges of each formation, constantly searching for targets that could delay the Soviet push. Japanese commanders, now facing rapid encirclement, tried to reorganize their lines and retreat to stronger positions. However, every retreat required roads, and every road became another opportunity for ambush. Soviet reconnaissance units traveled quickly through the countryside, supported by PTRD shooters, who moved ahead to clear paths. Whenever Japanese columns attempted to escape, they encountered resistance at river crossings, steep bends, or narrow passes. The rifle's heavy round cracked through the air, leaving a trail of wrecked vehicles in its path. These losses slowed Japanese movement and created pockets of trapped soldiers who could not reach safety before the next Soviet units arrived. In some areas, the rifle's impact extended beyond ambushes. During assaults on fortified points, PTRD teams targeted firing loops, wooden barricades, and light bunkers. The powerful round cut through structures that offered only partial protection. Once openings appeared, infantry rushed forward to secure the positions. This combined approach turned many defensive outposts into temporary obstacles rather than major threats. Japanese troops inside these positions often felt isolated and unable to influence the broader battle. The rifle's effects also shaped morale. For Soviet soldiers, carrying a weapon capable of stopping enemy armor brought a sense of confidence. Even when facing unexpected Japanese vehicles emerging from tree lines or from behind hills, PTRD teams responded quickly. They had trained for these moments during the preparation phase, and now those lessons guided their actions. They moved without hesitation, set up quickly, and fired with calm precision. The knowledge that their shots could alter the progress of the entire formation reinforced their determination. For Japanese crews, the opposite feeling spread. Each time a vehicle was hit, its thin hull buckled or cracked. The destructive energy of the 14.5mm round left deep scars across metal plates, and engines coughed out smoke before going silent. Tankettes with open-top turrets offered little defense against the heavy impact. Crews sometimes abandoned their vehicles immediately after the first strike, knowing that staying inside meant facing another shot. This fear undermined coordination, and armored support often fell apart under the pressure of repeated ambushes. As the Soviets moved closer to major strongholds such as Mukden and Changchun, Japanese armored resistance weakened further. The few remaining tankettes and armored cars were scattered among retreating infantry units. PTRD teams continued to operate with increasing efficiency, targeting any vehicle that threatened the advance. Each successful engagement created more openings for Soviet infantry, cavalry, and mechanized units to push forward without delay. In the final phase of the breakthrough, the rifle's importance became even clearer. Soviet commanders needed to maintain momentum while crossing mountain ranges and wide rivers. Heavy artillery lagged behind, slowed by terrain. Armored divisions moved carefully to avoid mechanical stress, but PTRD teams carried their rifles across bridges, ravines, and steep hills without significant difficulty. Their presence ensured that Japanese vehicles could not surprise or disrupt the advance, even when other weapons struggled to keep up. With each passing day, Soviet forces broke through deeper layers of Japanese defenses. The PTRD played a role that extended far beyond simple armor destruction. It had become a strategic tool, a force multiplier that opened routes, disrupted formations, and prevented Japanese units from stabilizing. It protected Soviet tanks from flank attacks, supported infantry clearing operations, and secured vital crossing points. By the time the Soviets approached the heart of Manchuria, Japanese mechanized resistance had nearly collapsed. The rifle that once seemed outdated stood at the center of the breakthrough. It had proven adaptable, reliable, and devastating against the type of armor Japan depended on. And as the advance neared its final objectives, the true legacy of the weapon began to take shape. The PTRD-41 had not only contributed to the destruction of Japanese vehicles, it had helped build the path that carried the Red Army across Manchuria with remarkable speed. As the Soviet offensive swept across the final stretches of Manchuria, the resistance of Japanese armored forces continued to crumble. Roads once guarded by thin-walled tankettes now lay open. Columns of infantry and cavalry moved through mountain passes with fewer obstacles each day. The speed of the Soviet advance surprised even veteran commanders, who expected prolonged fighting in the rugged terrain. Instead, Japanese defensive lines collapsed faster than predicted, in part because their armored machines could no longer protect key positions. The PTRD-41, once carried by skeptics, now stood as one of the many small tools that accelerated the entire campaign. When Soviet troops reached the major rail centers and industrial towns of the region, they found abandoned Japanese vehicles scattered along the roads. Many showed the familiar round entry holes created by 14.5mm rounds. Some lay overturned beside ditches, while others remained stuck across narrow pathways, rusting in the late summer heat. These wrecks marked the path of the advancing columns, like quiet reminders of how vulnerable the Japanese machines had been. For many Soviet soldiers, passing these wrecks brought a sense of recognition. They knew the sound, the impact, and the effect of every shot that had carved through those thin plates. The broader strategic situation reflected this collapse. Japanese forces in Manchuria had tried to consolidate around major cities such as Mukden and Harbin, hoping to create zones where they could slow the Soviet push. But as Soviet armor and infantry closed in from multiple directions, Japanese units found themselves isolated. Attempts to retreat were slowed by destroyed vehicles blocking roads, and by PTRD ambushes positioned along likely escape routes. Each attempt to form a new defensive line failed before it could stabilize. The combined pressure of Soviet tanks, artillery, and infantry created a situation where even small disruptions had large consequences. In these final days, the PTRD continued to play roles that extended far beyond simple vehicle destruction. Infantry used it to breach light barricades, disable machine gun points, and suppress defenders hiding inside wooden structures. The weapon's heavy rounds shattered cover that Japanese soldiers relied on, clearing paths for the infantry to move forward without waiting for larger guns. In rural areas filled with farmhouses and makeshift defensive posts, the rifle helped reduce threats quickly. Its presence meant that no small structure or lightly protected position could delay the advance. The momentum created by this constant pressure affected the morale of both sides. Soviet soldiers moved with confidence, knowing that their smallest anti-armor teams could neutralize many of the threats ahead. Japanese troops, meanwhile, realized that their armored vehicles could not buy the time they needed. Each failed attempt to hold a road or defend a pass changed the rhythm of the battle. Instead of organized resistance, many Japanese forces fought in scattered groups, unable to rely on mechanized support. Without armored screens or mobile firepower, they struggled to slow the Soviet units moving across wide distances. The collapse of Japanese mechanized capacity led to rapid Soviet breakthroughs. Rail lines were captured with little opposition. Key airfields fell within days. The PTRD-41 did not single-handedly decide the campaign, but it shaped the fighting in countless small moments that added together. Every disabled tankette opened another route. Every shattered armored car weakened another Japanese unit. Every fast ambush created an opportunity for Soviet forces to advance before Japanese troops could react. As the Manchurian operation neared its end, Soviet analysts began reviewing the weapons' performance. They examined captured Japanese vehicles and measured the penetration effects. Reports noted that even angled armor on some tankettes failed to stop the heavy round at close range. The rifle had performed consistently across multiple types of terrain: forests, plains, villages, and mountains. It worked in wet conditions, dry heat, and thick humidity. Unlike more advanced weapons, it required no complicated servicing. Its use depended mainly on the skill and patience of the shooter. These findings surprised some senior officers who had doubted the rifle's usefulness earlier in the war. During the European campaigns, the PTRD had gradually fallen out of the spotlight as German armor outgrew the weapon's capabilities. But in Manchuria, the rifle demonstrated that anti-tank tools do not lose their value simply because enemy equipment evolves in one theater. Different environments, different opponents, and different tactical needs can create new roles for old weapons. The PTRD-41 became a clear example of this principle. Soldiers who carried the rifle also developed a deeper respect for its design. Many remembered the awkward shape and heavy recoil from their first encounters with it, but the weapon's simplicity had proven invaluable. It rarely malfunctioned, even after long marches or rough handling. Its long barrel maintained accuracy under harsh conditions. The straightforward loading system allowed shooters to fire under pressure, even when lying in mud or working from cramped positions. These qualities made the rifle feel reliable at moments when reliability mattered most. The legacy of the PTRD-41 also extended beyond the battlefield. After the war, military historians and engineers studied the weapon to understand why it had succeeded, despite its crude appearance. They noted that its effectiveness came from a combination of high-velocity ammunition, simple mechanics, and adaptable tactics. Unlike more sophisticated weapons, the PTRD relied on physics rather than engineering complexity. Its designers had focused all the weapon's energy into a single powerful shot. When aimed correctly, that shot delivered enough force to change the outcome of a skirmish or stop an armored vehicle long enough for infantry to gain the upper hand. This simplicity also influenced post-war thinking about infantry weapons. Many armies realized that anti-tank solutions did not always require advanced machinery. Lightweight, portable tools remained important, especially in environments where heavy vehicles struggled to move. Lessons from Manchuria encouraged future weapon designers to create systems that could be carried easily and maintained under harsh conditions. Even as technology advanced, the idea of simplicity and raw power continued to shape modern infantry weapons. For the Japanese perspective, the campaign highlighted the dangers of relying on outdated armored vehicles. Their tankettes and light cars had been effective in earlier conflicts, but they were not designed to survive hits from high-velocity rounds. The Manchurian campaign demonstrated how quickly armor could lose relevance when faced with new threats. The collapse of their mechanized units became a warning to military planners worldwide. Mobility and speed are valuable, but without sufficient protection, vehicles cannot influence modern battlefields. As the war in Asia came to an end, the PTRD-41 began to fade from active service. New technologies emerged, including rocket-based infantry weapons that offered greater penetration and range. But the rifle story did not disappear. Veterans who had carried it remembered its strength, weight, and impact. They remembered the moment when a simple steel tube proved its worth in some of the most difficult terrains of the final year of the war. They remembered how the rifle helped them move forward, open roads, and push through enemy defenses. The weapon remained a symbol of underestimated strength. It showed that even crude tools can shape history when used in the right place at the right time. In Manchuria, the PTRD-41 became more than a flawed early war experiment. It became an unexpected hero in a campaign defined by speed, terrain, and tactical adaptability. By the time the final guns fell silent, one fact had become clear. The ugly Duckling rifle that had once been mocked by its enemies had played a decisive role in breaking the mechanized backbone of the Japanese forces. It had proven that power does not always come from complex designs or heavy armor. Sometimes it comes from a single, simple shot, delivered with precision. The PTRD-41 ended the war not as a forgotten weapon, but as a reminder that even the most underestimated tools can change the course of a campaign when the battlefield favors their strengths.